Hey all, here are OS Reviews. In this video, we're taking a look at the PELADN WO4. This is a mini PC from a brand that is actually new to us on this channel. So it's going to be a competitor to the likes of Beelink, Chewy, mini-sized computers that we've seen previously, or a tiny desktop. And this one here sells for around $200 give and take, and it's configured with 16 gigs of RAM, 512 gigabytes of built-in SSD that can be further augmented or expanded, and it's powered by the AMD Ryzen 5 5600H processor, which is actually pretty capable for this price point. It's built on a 7nm architecture, but still packing performance that's a little bit faster than the Ryzen 5700U on passmark scores by around 35%, which is, again, pretty solid. It can also be used for some light gaming, as well as some video editing work directly on this machine, compared to some of the Intel Celeron-based machines are a little bit weaker in terms of graphics. Often you would have to look at i3, i5, or i7s instead to find a similar performer, but again, those often cost more as well, so a pretty decent value here on paper. Manufactured again by TSMC, similar to some of the flagship Qualcomm Snapdragon 8th Gen series chips, so it's pretty cool to see that the cost of these mini PCs are continuing to provide more value as time goes on. It's also powered by an active fan that also features a heat pipe or heatsink for added cooling to ensure consistent performance at higher loads. And then on the inside, you have dual channel RAM, as well as another caddy that can be used to pop in a 2.5-inch SATA hard drive in addition to SSDs, providing PCIe Gen 3 speeds relatively quick. However, it is using DDR4 RAM out of the box, so keep that in mind. Compared to some of the newest, maybe Intel-powered mini PCs have started to upgrade to DDR5 RAM, having a slight advantage when it comes to multitasking super quickly. But again, the processor and also graphics on here are going to be higher end by comparison. The Type-C port here is rated for full spec, so data transmission and also display output can be supported. And yes, this particular machine can be mounted using a VESA adapter onto the back of a monitor or TV, kind of hiding it from view if you want to. So taking a closer look at the packaging here next, the box here is actually quite shiny here on the surface, showing some pretty good presentation. And on the inside here, we have, of course, just the WO4 mini PC we'll take a closer look at in a moment. Some extra accessories down below here include the power adapter, 19 volts, 4.74 amps. So just keep that in mind. It's not quite as compact, but considering it is a desktop computer and you have to plug it into power at home anyways, I think it should be mostly fine. Uses a barrel connection port though, instead of, say, USB Type-C. We also get a bundled HDMI cable as well for connecting to external monitor, the SATA SSD mounting adapter, which is crafted out of metal with the aforementioned screws, which are optional, as well as a ribbon cable adapter for the hard drive if you want to pop that in. So everything you need to really get started is going to be included here. Closer look at the mini PC, we see the continued kind of holographic sticker design going on, just adding a touch to the character since it is otherwise a pretty typical kind of black box design. And something I do really like though is the top is the magnetic lid that is really easy to just pop open and find access to the dual channel RAM, SSD, and hard drive bays, just making it a lot easier to access these components compared to having to unscrew something on the back, for example. It's a pretty nice design touch, and then locks in securely with those 4 magnets. Here on the front, we have access to some I/O like power, 2 front-facing USB 3.0 ports, Type A, which is nice, USB Type-C, 3.5mm headphone jack. And then on the back here, we see even more of the cooling for the active fan of VESA mounts, soft touch rubber feet that prevents it from sliding around on a table if you're setting it down, and the remaining I/O here on the back, including 2 more full-size Type A ports, as well as a display port, full-sized HDMI. So along with the USB Type-C on the front, those are the 3 built-in display ports. And also you get 2 Ethernet ports. Reminder here that for faster setup during initial boot, you can try to refrain from connecting to Wi-Fi or Ethernet, bypassing that step in Windows to more quickly get into the Windows desktop environment. Otherwise, during the initial setup process, you may have to wait for an hour or so for all of the latest updates to install for the first time. So that's kind of a tip if you want to get into Windows more quickly the first time to bypass this step. And there's also going to be just a power adapter port. So a pretty clean layout with, I think, sufficient I/O for such a small computer at the end of the day. Here it is next to something like an average size phone, roughly 6.5 inches here to serve as a reference. So really not bad, kind of takes up very little space on a desk compared to a larger tower style desktop that was the norm just a couple of years ago. Closer look at the Windows desktop, it does boot up extremely quickly, under 10 seconds on a cold state, and the 512GB SSD version has roughly 426GB give and take free when you take it out of the box because of the operating system, but that's pretty much par for the course. I can also verify that it is indeed a fully licensed and activated version of Windows 11 Pro. General navigation around the UI also seems to be quite zippy and responsive. Opening different panels as well as tabs in Windows all seems to be a little bit more snappy compared to some of the other budget Intel Celeron based mini PCs we've seen previously in the $200 range. You don't really have to be waiting too long at all for any animations to be loading, even if you're opening up different windows and doing a bit of multitasking as well. And that's mostly backed by the benchmark scores as well. Looking at Passmark, it actually scores a little bit north of 16,600, which is quite good. You can tell it's a 6-core processor with 12 threads, averages around 45 watts again, turbos up to 4.2 gigahertz. And even though it's no longer the newest chip on the market, it still is a pretty competitive score, as we can see here, in terms of compute performance, actually getting a little bit higher than even the Apple M2 octa-core kind of base version, which is getting closer to 15,600, so about 1,000 points higher using this synthetic benchmark score. Now, of course, synthetic benchmarks don't always translate directly with real-world performance, but at the very least, it provides us with a frame of reference, and it does feel like a pretty zippy experience, again, despite having more animations built into Windows. So yeah, it's a pretty capable chipset that's perhaps only superseded by the Max version of some of those Apple Silicon equivalents. Just as reference, the other Ryzen 7 5700U mini PC that we checked out recently was from Ace PC or Ace Magician. That one, by comparison, scores 15,600 on Passmark, which is roughly 1,000 points lower, despite it being an octa-core architecture instead of a hexa-core one like what we see here. And the reason for that is because the 5700U Ryzen 7 chip actually has a slightly lower clock speed of 1.8 gigahertz by default compared to the base 3.3 gigahertz of this Ryzen 5, drawing only around 15 watts and maxing out at 25 watts even at a turbo load compared to the typical 45 watts that this particular chip is using. So it will be a little bit more power hungry. However, it translates to pretty solid performance, and it's kind of interesting to see that this Ryzen 5 is again a touch higher, in fact, in these Passmark scores than the Ryzen 7. Part of that might be identifiable through the naming structure that AMD uses as well. The U-series chips compared to the H-series chips, kind of like on Intel's chips as well, a subclass can be referenced that perhaps prioritizes efficiency over clock speed and performance. Just for reference, some of the other roughly $200 mini PCs from Intel as part of their Celeron N97 and 100 line usually gets around 5,800 on Passmark, and it's instead a quad-core processor, also having a lower 3.6 gigahertz max turbo speed, again compared to the over 4 gigahertz on this model, but it is a more thermally efficient chip as a result. And also the N100 here for reference is also around 5,300 on Passmark. So you get the idea. The performance in this particular chipset is going to be roughly 3 times higher or more performant, at least on paper. And you do feel part of that difference. Again, everything in terms of transitions and animations just feels a little smoother, faster to respond. You don't really have to be waiting for anything to load compared to some of those, again, Celeron equivalents that we used to see more commonly at this price point. It's no longer the case that computers like these ran super slowly, but now you can get some decent performance even for slightly heavier usage. Now, in terms of the noise, it's actually relatively quiet. So when the computer is idling and not really processing anything, it actually turns off the fan and it's completely quiet. It's really only when you're pressing it a little harder that you're able to hear the fan kick in when necessary to sustain performance for longer durations or loads. But overall, it's not distracting. It's still just a very quiet hum there in the background. Taking a quick look at web browsing performance next, as expected, it's a pretty performant and snappy experience. Wi-Fi reception quality, by the way, has also been quite good, getting almost full bars, even though we're a little bit further from the router at the moment, supporting dual band Wi-Fi. We're able to very quickly load up any articles and web pages, even more complex ones like The Verge, having plenty of videos, ads, and scrolling elements on the page, but everything loads almost instantly the moment you click on it, as you can see here. So for web browsing, reading, researching things, this is not going to be problematic at all, even leveraging some of the, again, more advanced features that modern browsers like Edge and Chrome are beginning to experiment with, but loading speeds are still respectable. We can also check here on the task manager that with half a dozen tabs or so open with different video streaming as well as complex web pages, only using about 2% of CPU at the moment, we are consuming a little bit more memory within Edge because these are slightly heavier tabs at the moment, but generally speaking, I was able to multitask comfortably, even opening up around 24 tabs in the browser, whether Chrome or Edge, still proved to be pretty snappy in my experience, and I was able to still jump back and forth. The pages were still held in the memory without reloading. Let's also try jumping into some video playback next, pulling up stats for nerds and clicking on play. Right now we have it at 4K resolution. And you can see that at the very beginning of this video, it is a pretty long clip, over 11 hours long. We are noticing a couple more dropped frames there, but it should stabilize after a couple seconds of playback. And to the human eye, it still looks very smooth, working quite nicely. So if you're using this for media purposes, whether it is streaming back YouTube, Netflix, or watching back local video files that you have stored on the computer, it's going to be actually a pretty decent experience. We can, of course, also drop it down to 1080. That's going to be even more responsive. Now we have 0 drop frames, as you can see there. And again, the Wi-Fi reception being solid enough means we can scrub into other parts of the video, and it still loads back almost instantly, as you can tell. Now, Microsoft Word, that is a question I've received recently on another mini PC review, is not pre-included here, nor do you get a fully activated license of Microsoft Word anymore with pretty much any mini PC on the market currently, unfortunately. It was something that we used to see more commonly on computers in the 2010s, for example. That being said, when setting up the computer, I did see an offer for a 1-month trial of Microsoft 365, which will give you access to the full suite of Office tools and also online syncing capabilities, but it will elapse at the end of that duration. But it's pretty much par for the course these days. However, there are alternatives that you can consider instead. For example, accessing the online version of Microsoft Word, Excel, and PowerPoint is completely free to use. It's basically their competitor to Google Docs. In fact, here's a couple of examples, also loading quite quickly as long as you have internet connectivity, that is, and honestly getting you the bulk of features I think most people would find useful as well. So this part using Word Online is going to be free, including again PowerPoint, Excels, etc. And everything is still loading nicely even on slightly more complex documents. Not too surprising, because on even some of the entry-level Celeron Intel chips, we already saw how Office tasks like these can now be performed pretty smoothly. So on an even higher end processor that's more performant, it's rarely going to miss a beat when it comes to basic productivity like this. In fact, even for slightly higher productivity tasks, like some photo editing if you're using Photoshop, even Microsoft Paint these days has some generative AI capabilities of creating content and erasing backgrounds built in, so it requires a little bit more resources now to run locally, or doing some video editing work runs surprisingly quite smoothly on a machine with hardware like this. And on here, you are definitely able to edit even 4K video files. So in my testing, I tried exporting a 1-minute long 4K file, and it took me slightly under a minute, around 58 seconds, to export it, which I find to be more than serviceable. On a equivalent Celeron entry-level chip, it would usually take 2 or 3 times longer, if not finding it to be even more challenging when it comes to the editing experience slowing down to a crawl as well. And also taking advantage of that GPU and CPU horsepower would be some light coding work. So if you are a software engineer or student, maybe doing some data science work, it's not going to be too problematic. So again, for students and some light work, it's a surprisingly very serviceable experience. Now, the one other app that is pre-installed on here may be a little different if you're coming from an Intel computer, would be the AMD software on here, which allows you to further slightly optimize and customize the hardware experience. So what we're able to do, for example, is if you're launching into a game, you can open kind of a gaming profile mode that will try and optimize all of its resources on the title that you're playing back, in addition to tracking your duration gamed as well as average frame rate within a title as well, and see how much GPU utilization, VRAM utilization, and CPU you are consuming, slightly more in depth compared to the task manager view that comes as default, allowing for a little bit more customization and also checking for some firmware updates, driver updates from here as well. And of course, as a full desktop operating system, you have access to millions of applications, drivers, legacy tools that runs on a full version of Windows, whether that's going to be slightly more optimized titles from the Microsoft Store or any executables or exes that you download yourself, connecting to other peripherals by USB accessories are all going to be working here just fine. So when it comes to app support and compatibility, it's definitely an advantage of a more legacy desktop operating system like this. You can find pretty much any available software and it's bound to work. Again, as long as you have enough storage space that is on the SSD, which again at almost 500 gigabytes, I think should be fine for most folks out there. It's at least a bump compared to just a couple of years ago when mini PCs in the $200 range would have only provided 64 or 128 gig of storage. And again, it's further upgradable if desired, although it doesn't have a micro SD or SD card slot built directly into the chassis, which might be a convenient I/O if you're trying to transfer images out of a camera, for example. But aside from that, overall, pretty easy to upgrade as well. So again, animations as well as navigation here, all remaining quite smooth. Taking a quick look at gaming, this is going to be Minecraft, and the Java version that is running at 1080p. We can see it's actually more than playable enough, actually averaging around 70 frame rates here, give and take. So it's going to be pretty smooth for the most part, even on a local version of the game. This one here is going to be League of Legends, also playing at 1080p resolution, and also very much playable. And this is going to be GTA 5, so a racing game using a bit more 3D rendering as part of the GPU, but still I think it's a pretty playable experience, maybe a little bit slower compared to what we saw with Minecraft earlier, still at full HD resolution, but certainly not bad. Similarly, here we have Fortnite, also as another reference, that is also playing back pretty smoothly. This is definitely a mini PC with these Ryzen 5 and Ryzen 7 chips that you're able to just press it a little bit harder compared to many of the equivalently priced Intel processors also sitting mostly in the Celeron line. Again, this thing is just going to squeeze out a bit more performance without struggling as much as $200 computers of the past. Here's also Forza as another example, Horizon 4, and as you can tell here, also loading at a pretty playable frame rate overall. Of course, you can always play back retro emulation style games, whether that's from older PlayStation consoles, Game Boy, GameCube, PSP, Nintendo DS, Sega Genesis, Atari, so on and so forth. Many which have even more simplified graphics are going to run even more smoothly, since those systems of the past had much more limited hardware than components like this these days. So for retro gaming, it even works well, honestly, on an Intel Celeron device these days. So on hardware like this, it's not going to have any issues with emulation either, on top of the more modern titles that we saw there from earlier. Even Cyberpunk, if you lower it to the minimum graphic settings, although the frame rates might be a little bit more wonky in a more AAA style modern game. However, you could have a more fluid gameplay experience in that case if you leverage cloud gaming, for example with Microsoft's Xbox xCloud or using Amazon's Luna, and as long as you're connecting to a reliable enough internet, you're able to stream it back on more powerful hardware over the cloud. That could certainly be another option to consider, since it is a very small and lightweight computer at the end of the day, still with integrated graphics compared to a discrete or dedicated graphics card, albeit a little bit stronger than generations past in this price range. So that is more or less it as far as our hands-on review of this WO4 mini PC. And even though this particular brand is new to us, I am kind of impressed. The hardware is very clean. I love the magnetic latch design of easily getting access to the internals without having to use even any screwdrivers. Even after an hour or two of use, pressing it a bit harder with gaming and video streaming, the top actually still remains cool to the touch here in the summer season. So the passive and active cooling are working quite nicely in sustaining the performance. Thermal throttling is generally not going to be an issue here. Yes, overall this machine will draw a little bit more power because of that 45 watt TDP, but it's not the end of the world since the performance makes up for it in terms of being just even more smooth and responsive. Now, as far as hardware, some things that's maybe missing would be a built-in microphone, not that I think it's super critical or essential. And like all other mini PCs we've seen recently, there is no built-in speaker. So it does just rely on sound, which is coming out from your monitor TV, or you can connect to wireless Bluetooth headphones or speakers, which works nicely as well, or the 3.5mm analog headphone jack that also was clean, offering solid volume output. Overall, again, performance has been excellent when it comes to a computer of its class. Again, And surprisingly, for an entry-level model, which I think is the part where these Ryzen AMD chips are definitely more of a value proposition, it appears after testing some of these out, whether it's video streaming, web browsing, even doing some video editing, as well as light gaming, it handles it surprisingly well considering these small dimensions that we're looking at. So you can check out more details if you're interested in the links down below. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been the WO4 Mini PC.